So we've been looking at economic analysis of a business. But economics aren't the only thing that govern it. And this is sort of the external economy and how the external economy fits with a business and how that begins to create things. But just as yesterday we were talking about the external analysis being followed by an internal analysis, by strengths and weaknesses, and matching those up. There may be a more interesting way of looking at strengths and weaknesses. And I'm going to do this section of it a little quickly, one, because we got a lot of things to do, but also because I touched on it when we were doing the summing up yesterday, and I don't want to repeat too much of it. What you have inside a company are a bunch of stuff. You own things. You employ people. You have processes. And you have managerial capabilities, managers who know how to do things. And these things can be strong or weak. But if we start looking at them as resources and capabilities, and start trying to assess how good are these resources, maybe we can be a little more sophisticated than doing strengths and weaknesses. We're really strong. Maybe we're not so strong. How can we make that more systematic? How can we think about what really matters? And companies have resources of different descriptions. They have things that are tangible. They have plant and equipment. If you're a mining company, you have deposits in the ground over which you hold a license to extract those mineral resources. If you're an advertising agency, you don't have a hole in the ground. Advertising agencies don't have very much of anything, do they, really? They have a bunch of computers. So what? Everybody's got computers. Is that the source of competitive advantage? Where does competitive advantage come from? It comes from the intangible assets that are partly human resources, but partly other things as well. We touched on some of them yesterday. Customer relationships matter an awful lot. The ability to innovate, find new ways of doing things, is one of the sources of value. Really hard to grab hold of and say, well, we're good at innovation. Well, are we? I don't know. Maybe you have a process behind that that makes you good at innovation. Google has a process for innovation. I think we'd call it an innovative company, right? Google has a human resources policy that says that every employee has 1 day a week free to do anything they damn please. Because they want you to experiment. They want you to come up with new ideas. They want you to play with something. Find a new way of doing something. Maybe it'll work. Maybe it won't. But we've got to innovate. So we'll give you 20% of your time free to do anything you want to do. They also have a policy where they recruit people and they have free food available. So you don't have to buy lunch or breakfast or dinner. And what happens? You find people hang around the office all the time. They have large sections of the offices at Google that don't have desks and chairs. They have sofas and beds. And what happens? People hang around. They break away from their work coding whatever it is they're coding or doing whatever admin functions they're doing and gather to talk about, ooh, how can we do this? And find somebody else who knows how to do it and invent things. That's how they invented an awful lot of the stuff that we use at Google. That's how Street View came about. Do they have Street View for Kiev. Street view, where that whole notion came out of a bunch of guys who were saying, well, we could do this. They've got these new cameras that are whatever, you can rotate them and we can stitch them together into a continuous picture. That's not a moving picture. It's a still picture, but it's continuous. You don't have these sort of abrupt fixes on it because you manipulate the edges of the photograph using a standard algorithm that means you can get a continuous picture. If we did that, we could fit this with maps, and people could not only read the map, but see what it looks like when they get there. Bingo, is an idea that came out of a bunch of people just playing around with a notion. But a funny thing happened at Google when they did this. I'm in danger of telling too many stories, so I'll stop with this one little story about it. There was a group of people in Arizona who were working for Google. And Google came in after they became a public company, and they started having to deliver value to shareholders in some fashion or other. And Google said, you're only supposed to take 1 day a week. And the coders in Arizona said, no, our work's too important. We're going to have 5 days a week that we're going to do work on whatever we want to. We don't want to write stuff for you to generate advertising revenue. We don't care whether you have advertising. We're working on the future. And they refused to work. And Google had a lot of trouble dealing with it, partly because they weren't in headquarters. They were in Arizona, a long way away from headquarters. They had another group that was working on some of the people who did YouTube stuff in Denmark, who quit en masse when Google tried to say you only have 20% of your time free to do whatever you want to do. They quit, set up their own company. Most of the brain power that they was working within their brains. Google might try to own the intellectual property by having patents and having employment contracts that captured intellectual property rights. But the real value of those people was still inside their heads. It wasn't covered by it because they hadn't stopped inventing things yet. And so an awful lot of the potential value of the company resided not in the fixed stuff or even the intangible assets that you can declare on a balance sheet by saying we own the patents over this or copyright over that. But in the ideas that the people were still generating. And this company in Denmark is now doing all kinds of really interesting things with video, and Google's having to buy some of it back from them. So a lot of the value, and we find, and you can do this, and scholars have done this kind of work, analyze where the value proposition is within businesses. And they find that in most businesses, and to a greater extent in service-oriented businesses rather than manufacturing-oriented businesses, the value lies less and less in tangible property, tangible resources, and more in intangible things. And these intangible things are the things that become the repository of the future value of a business. If you compare the share prices of companies on the stock exchange to the net asset value of the companies, and you'll be doing some finance, I think, later today that probably look at net asset value. If you look at the average price of companies on established stock markets, you'll find that they're typically, the market capitalization of a company is 2 or 3 times higher than the accounts show. That's because the accounts aren't looking at where the residue of value is. The value sits someplace else. And so if you're a strategist, if you're trying to put together a company, if you're trying to evaluate a company as an investment banker, if you're trying to decide as an investor which companies you're going to invest in and which ones you're not going to invest in, if you're a business manager who's trying to decide where do we invest whatever funds we have available, you're going to be looking less at these tangible things than you are at where can we accumulate intangible value. The value of a newspaper isn't in the printing press. You outsource that. The value for a printing company may be in the printing press, but chances are it's in the customer relationship with the publications that need the printing press to be worked on, rather than the press itself. Hello. So, if we can do this kind of thing, look at resources and find out how they're valuable. And so a lot of attention in strategy has been looking at these kinds of things. Financial resources. If you've got the ability to generate finance, it helps. But money is a commodity. In a time of a credit crunch, of course, it's going to be a little more difficult to find money than it would be otherwise. But even in a credit crunch, we've seen a lot of businesses, as Maria, as we were talking about, a lot of the apps businesses are finding venture capital. Even though we're in the middle of what's supposed to be the biggest financial crisis in the world, lots and lots of little startup companies are getting venture capital money thrown at them to work on new businesses because they've got ideas. And people, investors, have hope that somebody will have more ideas than the investors have, which is probably pretty easy. And one of the ways that came out to do this is to say that we need to look at resources and capabilities to determine whether they're valuable, and particularly if they're valuable to customers or potential customers. Are they rare? Because if they're rare, then it'll be harder for competitors to get hold of them. Are they difficult to imitate? Oh, goodness. I've heard worse ringtones than that. Good. Are they difficult to imitate? Because if they're difficult to imitate, then it's going to be difficult for a competitor to get there. And if there is no substitute for it, if they're non-substitutable, then those kinds of things together are likely to be the source of competitive advantage. And that allows you then to go back and look at your resources and say, are your journalists rare? Are they valuable? Are they difficult to imitate? Is your mineral, if you're a mining company, is your mineral resource something that's easily available in all kinds of different places? If it is, then it's not going to be as valuable. If it's, there was a time, the company I know very well in Germany, that had a lead and zinc mine in the Harz Mountains near the division between East Germany and West Germany. And it had really rich, pure seams of lead and zinc. And oddly enough, for Germany, this became a good place to do lead and zinc mining. That is, until somebody discovered in a really easily accessible place in Canada, a deposit of lead and zinc that was very close to the surface. And Freeport Mining Company began to mine in Canada. And the company in the Harz Mountains, where they had to dig deep underground to get to this stuff, suddenly found itself, its goods were not nearly as profitable as they had been before, because they were so much easier to mine in Canada than it was in central Germany. It was easier to ship the goods into Bremen or Bremerhaven or even into Hamburg and distribute to the same customers that were getting it before from a local mine. That resource ceased to be valuable, rare, difficult to imitate, or non-substitutable. So non-substitutable, it's still qualified. It still can't do anything, the things you can do with lead and zinc that you can't do with anything else. And so that resource became very different. And that company then changed its specialization, because what they found was that the real value of their company wasn't in the lead and zinc deposits, it was in the technology that they had developed to refine the lead and zinc. So they started selling that technology to Australian-based companies that were also discovering large deposits of lead and zinc. And so the company continued to be very valuable, but for completely different reasons, because it had technology. It had knowledge of processes. It had innovative processes behind that were creating new ways of doing things, that as soon as somebody caught up with their technology, they came up with better ways of doing it. And so the real value of the company wasn't in all of that. It was in the brain power of the people who worked in it. And so the company continued and operated very successfully for very, very many years until everybody caught up with the technology and it ceased to be valuable, rare, difficult to imitate, non-substitutable. Now it's a travel company. They ended up, because the government forced upon them the rescue of a big shipping company that used to ship their ore and refined metals. So they rescued this company when it was going bankrupt. And that company happened to have an airline that did package holiday tours, that took Germans to the south coast of Spain for their summer holidays. And that business began to look better and better. And so they flipped the whole company around, and it's now a travel company. Very strange. But this kind of thing is a clue to how you assess strengths and weaknesses, rather than just saying, oh, we're really strong. Do something with it. Make something with it. And this chart, I'm not going to go all the way through it with you, but it says the more of these things have, the stronger your competitive advantage is going to be, the longer it's going to last. And that seems to me to make sense. Empirically, that is, working with data sets, it's really difficult to trace all of these things back because there's so many factors that go into whether companies succeed or not. But conceptually, this strikes me as being absolutely has to be true. And if that's true, then maybe the job of senior management isn't so much analyzing that external environment and finding the right position, but accumulating resources that are valuable, rare, and difficult to imitate, and creating the environment where innovation can take over and you can identify when your company no longer makes sense and you have to convert it into something else, or that maybe you have to go out of business. Maybe the important thing is knowing that you should get out of the mobile handset business before you've suffered all the losses that Nokia has suffered in the last couple of years. Maybe they should have sold a long time ago. Maybe that's where the real value is, in the anticipation of changes. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about resources. We could talk about that forever because that's a really, really big part of the equation. The third component of this analysis was this institutional stuff, and this is a little trickier. I want to spend a little time with this. We talk about institutions a lot in the strategy theoretical world. People don't talk about it all that much in business, except you will hear them talking periodically about the things we know of as institutions. Some of these things are formal, and they came out as we were doing pest analysis. Some things are laws and regulation that are formal requirements. The way we do things around here, the rules of the game, are what people talk of as being institutions. And if you have strong institutions, that's what makes it difficult to do things that are outside of certain areas, but makes it easier to do other kinds of things. So if you look at the Metro case and you say, what are the institutional arrangements here? Well, on the formal institutional side, you've got these politically enforced regulatory requirements that force things in certain directions and make it very difficult to do other kinds of things. Make it really difficult to set up a wholesale fresh fruit and vegetable arrangement without the partnership of the local governments. But what if you could make a partnership with local governments? Couldn't Metro go in and organize the local market? Sell its services to the state government so that on the basis that if we put our technology in and our logistics, we'll take a fee for that, and you can have the fresh fruit and vegetable market, you can own it, and control the food supplies, but will help you make it much more efficient. It's a change of business model. It's not the way we do things in Germany or Kiev. But it's a different way of doing things that responds to local circumstances, that reinvents the business model in a way that works without diminishing the value of the resource we have in good quality logistics and really good knowledge of how refrigeration systems work. You might be able to solve that problem. That doesn't mean you've solved the problem on the highways. Highways is still going to be a problem. So maybe it still have to wait for it. But it's a way around things. You look at the institutional arrangements and you say, maybe we can do things differently. But those are formal institutions. Then you have informal institutions as well. The way we do things around here is, in many ways, it's a mindset. The way we do things in this country is different from the way we do things in another country. I was talking to somebody yesterday who said that he was talking historically about Ukraine and how Ukraine had been part of Poland and then separated, and a lot of people in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian territories, felt they were really different from the Poles and really very much more like the Russians. And then they went to Russia and saw how very different people were and said, no, we're Ukrainians. And that's how he describes the Ukraine coming together historically as a nation, because it's different from Poland and different from Russia and can't possibly really be the same thing. And this is hundreds of years ago. Why? Because the way we do things around here, subtle rules, some of which are law, some of which are regulation maybe, but a lot of which are custom and practice. Some of them are religious. Some of them are broadly things we call cultural. And so those kinds of factors as well are going to limit what you can do in certain directions, but enable you to do things in other directions. And so you look at what things are enabled and what things are constrained, and that will help you make your choices, knowing that not that you can never do something that's against constraints, but it will cost you more to do it. It will take more time. It will be more difficult. And the more deeply held certain beliefs and value systems are, the more difficult it is to work against them. And so that gives us another way of beginning to interpret the setting in which, the context in which we're doing business. And so we talk about informal and formal institutions a lot, particularly among the people who do the sort of theory of international business and theory of trade. In absence of strong institutions, you may not be able to get much business done at all. We'll come to some examples of that. Institutions reduce the degree of uncertainty. One of the things you find happens a lot is that people who work in the same industry will come up with standard contracts. Why? There's a good economic reason for having a standard contract. Because it takes less time to negotiate. If everybody's using the same contract, you don't have to negotiate all the time. And if the capabilities of a company are the real source of value, if the manager's knowledge is the real source of value, why tie up your managerial staff negotiating little contracts all the time instead of just going on and getting new business, doing new things, innovating new products? So you come up with standards that allow you to do things. When I was working in Germany, the Germans had a standard for washing machines. It said that all washing machines had to have stainless steel drums inside. The Italians had a regulation that said that all washing machines had to have plastic drums. What that meant was that the Italian manufacturers of washing machines were protected against German competition. And the German manufacturers of washing machines were protected against Italian competition. That also meant that the Italian consumers didn't have the best quality machines, and it meant that the German consumers didn't have the cheapest possible machines. European Union came along and said, no, we can't have this. What we need is standards across the whole European Union. And so they worked together, the bureaucrats came up with a standard contract, took a lot of work and a lot of negotiation, and suddenly you have a very competitive marketplace where you have cheap machines and you have expensive machines. Consumers have a lot more choice. It was an efficient way of doing things was to create an inefficiency by creating a standard that limited the scope of activity, but gave greater freedom, on the other hand, for people to compete. Gave rules of the game that made it easier to do things. And those can be summed up this way. I'm not going to spend too much time going through these charts. You've got them. You can work them out for yourself, and I've given you a link to get you to the thing. But if you're doing personalized business, the first piece of business you do is relatively expensive. But as you go through time, it becomes less and less expensive because you become familiar with doing things, because you have a personal relationship with your customers, and your customers begin to trust you. And so the unit cost of doing business goes down again. But as you scale up, your costs get higher and higher, because doing business personally with everybody is costly. And so the benefits curve goes exactly the opposite way. You've got low benefits at the beginning, but over time you get the greatest amount of benefit from it. And so in the early stages of a business, you lose money. In the middle stages, once you begin to be successful at things, you begin to have lots of good customers who trust your business, and you become very profitable as an enterprise. But then you hit this situation where when you try to go to a large scale, the cost of delivering highly personalized services is really expensive. And the benefits decline rapidly, and you start losing money again. Does that make sense? The economics of that makes sense. If you can, however, standardize things, then the dynamics change. When you have a rule under which you exchange things so that you don't have to have lots of personal intervention to do things, initially, you get very high costs, yes, and at a certain point, it crosses over and your costs decline. You get economies of scale. And that's part of the reason for institutionalizing certain practices. Yeah.
In the first example, it grows because you have more customers, and that's more difficult.
Yeah, it rises because the costs are initially high, because costs are always high at the beginning of a business, always greater than the benefits. You always lose money at the beginning of any business venture. But the benefits begin to rise and the costs begin to drop because you have a trusting relationship with a small number of customers. As it moves on, as you get more and more customers, it becomes harder and harder to service more customers. Because you've got to build trust again with people. So you're right back basically at the beginning with every new customer. You're at the beginning of the relationship. Whereas if you can form a rule that this is the way we do things, it becomes easier, it becomes faster. You don't have the negotiation associated with it. And so that simplifies things, and you can make more money. And if you put the two of them together, you end up with this other thing that's, sorry about that, that's much too complicated for me to explain here. But I could do it if we have more time. You go through it and you say, there is a notion that what happens is, in any economic cycle, that you start out in a business that has no standard way of doing things. And over time, it develops standards, and so the one form supersedes the other as the way we work around here. You create institutional ways of doing things. And as you do that, you create a better economic proposition. And so if you can look at the institutional arrangements associated with a particular business in a particular place, if it helps you then that's fine. You ride with it. If it works against you, then you know you've got a lot of work to change it, to make it better for you, and you may have to abandon it because it just doesn't work for you at all. There's a common rule in venture capital that if you're in a place that has no real solid institutions, if it's a Wild West kind of thing, as we say in America, or if it's the palm oil industry in Malaysia, where in rural parts of Malaysia there are no rules. Individual chieftains run the proposition around the area. And whatever it is that they decide is going to be the rule is the rule, and it could change from day to day. Then you don't know how to do business, and you don't get any innovation, you don't get any efficiency, you don't get new ideas coming along. And so in absence of institutions, innovation is almost impossible, because anybody who's innovative will not bother in those settings. They'll go someplace else. They'll migrate. And that's what's happened with the Malaysian palm oil industry, is that they've got this vast wealth of palm oil territory, and they're not using it very well. They can say whether you like palm oil farming or not. Across the water in Indonesia, they have a very efficient palm oil industry because they've introduced rules and regulations. And they've come up with lots and lots of highly efficient ways of doing things that are highly efficient for mankind, but not particularly efficient for orangutans. The palm oil forests are where the orangutans live. And what they've done is they've cut down a lot of the stuff and turned into farming territory, the habitat that is where the orangutans live. But they have created an innovative industry. If you have built-in whimsical decision-making, if you have corrupt politicians, for example, where there is no rule of law, you end up with inefficient markets where the cost of doing business is too high to move it up to any kind of mass scale. And so you find in a cottage industry where everything is produced locally, having a strong chieftain who decides disputes, if he's more or less fair, it's fine. Begin to try to scale that up, it doesn't work at all. And so what you need to do, according to Peng and people like him who think this way, in addition to doing that economic analysis that filters things into the five forces model to understand the nature of competition, in addition to doing the resources analysis that tells you what sources of value you control, you also have to understand the context in which it's set, not only from an economic point of view, but from these institutional arrangements. And once you've got those three bits of the picture, you can judge whether your business is likely to be successful or not. Does that make any sense? That's a hard way of linking in all the politics and culture and all the rest of it. But I think it's important. And I think here, at some point or other, I've set an exercise for you, but I don't want to do that because we're way behind schedule. You want to do it? Okay. Shall we do it? Yes. Yes. Shall we try it? Groups of three? Take a look at formal and informal situations at Metro. What things make the Metro model work? What things stop the Metro model from working? In India. We're going to do the formal institutions really quickly because they're obvious, right? What are the formal institutions? Law. But which ones? Be specific. Which ones matter?
You mean
Regulate trade.
The regulation about state ownership of the marketplaces. The states own the marketplaces, that's regulated by law. There's also the regulation about foreign ownership and foreign direct investment that has to be limited in certain circumstances, but not in other circumstances. Right? Those are the two things that matter in this case. The foreign direct investment favors Metro right now because the likely competitors, Tesco, Walmart, Carrefour, they want to do retail. Their whole business model is based on retail, not wholesale. So they're prevented from entering the market as multi-brand retailers. That gives Metro a competitive advantage now. Simple. Second one, local farmers markets, big obstacle. Big obstacle. Constrains it a lot. That's simple. Let's do the informal ones because they're more fun. They're trickier. What did you talk about that was an informal way we do things around here?
have a couple of them, but
Okay.
for example, is sociocultural thing about vegetarians.
Right.
It can be religion.
It could be religion. Is it religion?
It also involves.
It's not based on, there's nothing particularly in either the Hindu or the Muslim faith that requires vegetarianism. It's not required in the religion as such, although it's custom and practice. It's associated with religion, but it's also present in the Muslim population, where it's definitely not in the religion at all. But there's a large vegetarian streak there. Now, that suggests a couple of things. One is that it is mixed with religion. And when you start trying to change people's religious beliefs to get them to change a business model, that's going to be really hard work, right? If they think it's religious. But if you could influence religious leaders in such a way to start talking differently about it, then you might be able to influence the population. Whether we could force people to eat meat is a different story. But is that going to be easy to solve this problem? No. Either way, it doesn't matter whether it's religious or merely cultural, it's going to be really hard to do. What else?
Poorness.
Poverty brings what by way of an institution? That's all right. I understood you, and if I can help you with vocabulary, that's fine. Maybe someday you'll help me with my Ukrainian. Probably not. I'm probably hopeless in that regard. Poverty. What's the institution about poverty? Poverty is an economic condition and influences the economic factors in terms of the purchasing power through the five forces analysis. But what institutions, what ways of thinking, ways of acting come with poverty?
For example, Metro Vision Carry could offer some bonus, some low price, and
Mm-hmm.
could use the situation because poverty is not only economic, but also social problem.
Yeah. Well, one of the things about poverty is that people do not have the ability to store food very easily, which means that they have to buy things regularly. So they get into the habit, the custom, of going to the market every day to buy things. That one of the things that does is it prevents the development of large retail stores, because people habitually think they need to buy food every day, partly because they don't have any place to store it, which is an economic factor. But it's also part of the ritual of food preparation, is that you always buy fresh food. And that's actually quite a nice thing. It makes people feel that makes the family, the mother of the family in particular, feel that she's doing something for her family by creating new food every day from fresh materials. And people take great pride in India in the way they cook, and that they're using fresh ingredients all the time. That becomes a cultural element that sits alongside this economic constraint. Now, does that help or hinder the business?
Poverty?
Yeah. No, not the poverty itself, but this custom of using fresh fruit and vegetables all the time. That helps this business. It also helps.
But now, according to the rule, they couldn't buy it. That's
Yeah.
why these wouldn't help. Right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So the formal institution is blocking it, but the informal institution of using fresh fruit and vegetables all the time, the pride that people take in their cooking, is working in favor of the business. It's working in favor of the business partly because it's constraining the ability of retail outlets to move to larger scale because people don't have the ability to store food. So they do have to shop every day, which is an economic necessity that's been turned into the virtue. But that also means that your customers, Metro Cash and Carry's customers, are the small retailers, and their business model is more likely to survive because people take pride in making fresh fruit and vegetables, using fresh fruit and vegetables every day for their business. So if you can overcome the administrative hurdle of that formal institution of the regulation, if you can find a way around that, you've got a marketplace that could be very solid for a very long time because it's unlikely to get westernized by supermarkets because people take pride in cooking fresh food every day.
With you, we try to focus on the factors which help the metro to stay there nowadays. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that very important is that it's German model, and many people think that German is a high quality,
Mm-hmm.
high quality
Yeah.
and service. And why people go there? Maybe I'm sure that not all the people in India are poor, and
Yeah.
there are a lot of families, so they will have obtained such a quality service,
Yeah.
high-level service.
Yeah. And in Bangalore in particular, that's more likely to be the case because Bangalore has more connections to the Western economies than the other parts of India. So Bangalore is actually the right place to start this business. So in that sense, it makes a lot of sense to do it here. But to scale it up, to make it really work, you've got to get something that applies across the board. And that's trickier. That's much, much more difficult. So we've identified a couple of things. We could probably go on. Did anybody else have an informal institution that sort of leapt out as being something really important? Something that people come take for granted?
Many people think that in India it's something like dangerous to buy food on
Mm-hmm.
the street, and all the foreigners will go to metro
Yeah.
because they know
Yeah.
that everything's okay.
Yeah, well, bear in mind, Metro's cash and carry business doesn't sell to consumers. It sells to restaurants and the small stores that don't have any storage facility, and they have to buy every day. Yes, they've gone retail. They've gone retail in Ukraine. And I think the notion behind Metro's business plan for India, I think, is that they lead with cash and carry and they follow up with supermarkets when circumstances permit. And that's why Metro's got a much better chance of getting it to work than Tesco or Walmart or whatever. In fact, if I were Metro, I would be trying to keep Tesco and Walmart and Carrefour away from the industry for as long as physically possible. Because the cash and carry approach works under current circumstances better than the supermarket model. But we've got a supermarket model ready to use as soon as the market circumstances force us in that direction. I think it's a really smart move, and that's why it's really good for Metro to be there at this early stage. But we've still got the problem with a formal institution. Okay, you see how this works? We could carry on and find some more things, but they basically fit into those camps. And therefore, we've now identified the source of the problem. We can overcome the regulatory environment by finding partnerships of some description with state governments. So we help make the fresh fruit and vegetable market more efficient. We get a fee for doing that, and we can set up other kinds of things. But that means we have to modify the business model quite a lot. The German model doesn't work. We have to become more of a service provider and less of a warehouse where people come and do things, because we're not going to own the marketplace. We're going to own a chunk of it. We limit the scope of our business and take on a service role. That's a strategic option that I think is actually quite a good one in this case. Not what they did. They waited. And gradually it's working. And these kinds of things lead to cultural factors that influence the way it works. I'm going to go through this stuff very quickly so we can do the other stuff later. You know, have you ever heard of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Yes. Lots of nods here. Good. A lot of people think this is a law of nature. That this is the way it works. This is the way people, this is the way human beings work. And that if you can satisfy the basic physiological requirements of food and shelter and security, then gradually you move up and up the scale until you start thinking about self-actualization, about achieving your full potential. Well, according to one study at least, that isn't the way it works in Asia. And if this is right, and I think there's reason to believe it. I've tested this with a lot of students from China and Vietnam and Japan and Thailand, and it does seem to be the case. They all feel very much the same way. That Confucian spirit of the collective being more important than the individual means that you never reach that stage where self-actualization takes place. What you want to is have status within your community, a social relationship that's acknowledged by your friends and neighbors, and that's the achievement of the greatest success. And that then, if you're moving from a European environment, which has a high degree of individualization, into an Asian marketplace, you may find that you're running into difficulties in the way you run your business, for example. There are layers of culture that happen at all different kinds of layers, including corporate cultures. And creating a corporate culture can help overcome some of these things. Some of the business culture ideas, a lot of the business culture ideas come from a study that was done in the late 1970s at IBM. Do you know Hofstede? Has anybody ever talked to you about Hofstede ever? And facets of culture? Hofstede's study was a fantastic one that everybody quotes all the time. In practice, in HR departments, in companies, every place, academic circles, it's taught in almost every textbook on strategy, on human resources management, on everything. Because it was such a unique opportunity. Hofstede got permission from IBM to do surveys of all the IBM employees all over the world. And IBM being the kind of company it was, they sort of forced everybody to answer this question. So there's a vast wealth of data from the same company. So the corporate culture was controlled for, was one company's culture, but it was every company in the world, or every country in the world, or every country in the developed world in late 1970s. And this data allowed them to take a look at how individual country cultures differ from each other. What they said was, basically, they measured things against what they called 5 different dimensions of culture. Power distance. How how much did people defer to the boss? Were people respectful of authority because the authority is in a senior position, in a powerful position? In Thailand, for example, it is illegal for a journalist to write something bad about the king. I know this because I have a student, a journalism student, who works for the Bangkok Post. And he has had regularly, as an editor, to kill stories because they said something bad about the king, said something that seemed not respectful because the king is regarded as a god. And so it was blasphemous. It was against religion to say something nasty about the king. And this offended his spirit as a journalist because he's a very liberal-minded person. But he said, I know we'll be shut down if we do this. The journalist will be arrested. The editor who lets it through will be arrested. So we can't do this. Power distance. The United States, power distance, relatively low. People say nasty things about the president all the time. And it's part of the national sport. Individualism versus collectivism. This is one of the splits that happens between Asian countries with Confucian background, Chinese backgrounds in particular, and Western backgrounds where individuals are more important and collectives are more important. It's one of the things that differentiates, to a certain extent, the UK and US approach to doing business from the German and French approach to doing business, which are more collectivist. Masculinity versus femininity. Is it macho, or is it sort of social and friendly and whatever? Are people willing to take on uncertainty, or are they afraid of uncertain things? And if people are afraid of uncertainty, you'll see less entrepreneurship, less entrepreneurial activity, possibly less innovation. And finally, do you have a short-term or a long-term orientation? Anyway, they've done lots and lots of different studies with this. Here's a few of them for 4 of the dimensions that they did for different countries at that time. And they mapped them. One particular pair stood out as having distinct differences. Power distance and individualism. And you ended up with clusters of countries among IBM employees where these characteristics were distinctly different. In all of those countries where there's a high degree of power distance, people are very respectful of the boss. There's not much individualism, so people work collectively for goals. So you can set up teams, and teams will work very well together. They'll be highly respectful of the boss, so they'll be very efficient in getting a lot of things done, and they'll be very dull in terms of coming up with new ideas and new products and new ways of doing things. They'll be very rooted in the way we do things around here. They'll be very tied to informal institutions. In France, Spain, Italy, main parts of continental Europe, there's high respect for the boss, but there's more sense of individuality. And that means that they behave slightly differently from the Chinese and the more structured societies of South America and whatever. And in those countries, what you find is that people will, again, probably be a little less innovative. There'll be more for personal gain. You won't have people as lifetime employees all the time. There'll be more striving for personal achievement, but they'll be less willing to take some risks. They'll be less willing to come up with new ideas and less willing to contribute things because they're overly respectful of power. And you find this other cluster, which are largely speaking North European and the Anglo-American variety, where people are much less respectful of the boss, which means you get faster turnover of people at the top of the company. You get people shifting in and out of jobs much more rapidly than you would in other places. You therefore get career paths where people are moving in and out of the company more frequently, which gives you a problem because you lose some of your best people. It gives you an advantage because you're able to recruit people much more frequently. You're able to bring new ideas into a place, which means it gets less static and less problematic. There are advantages and disadvantages to all of these things, but they're distinctly different, is what Hofstadter found with IBM.
Sorry, I've got a proposition.
Sure.
What about we think where would be Ukraine in this?
Well, you're anticipating me. I don't know. You'll have to tell me where Ukraine is. Are you respectful of authority? Of people in power?
I think more than a normal level in the East and Western Europe.
Yep, probably. That sounds right to me.
I
Yep.
think Ukraine could be somewhere between these Arabian countries and France.
Okay, so you think it's, you think it's somewhere over here, that there's more individuality and could be. Anybody else? What do you think? More importantly than that, which way do you think it's changing? Because if strategy is about the future, we want to know which way things are changing. My hunch is that it's moving in the individualistic direction, and it's probably moving down as well. This country strikes me as being less, from limited exposure I've had to you folks, less concerned about power distance than, say, Russia. Russia has this sort of notion that you've got to have a strong central power. And there's a kind of sense that, yeah, that's not the way, we've never really been comfortable with that. Not now and not in the past. There's always been a kind of rebelliousness about Ukraine. Even in the Soviet days, there was a rebelliousness about Ukraine. Sorry?
We are more like Italy.
You're more like Italy. Could be. Could be. Could be. In which case...
Prime Minister's in jail,
Yeah, that's well, it depends whether you say you put your prime minister in jail, but it's your president who puts your prime minister in jail. So maybe there's still a power notion there. The fact that your prime minister would be so rebellious against your president is perhaps an indication that she, at least, was not very respectful of power distance. Yeah. And what does that tell you then about which way you should arrange your trade? Should you go into a deeper association with the European Union, or should you do a deeper association in the customs union with the ex-Soviet states? Tricky. Well, you are physically in between, but where are you?
Well, I think
What trajectory are you on?
always been a desire to not be in any of them. But the trade was everywhere.
Yeah, at unfavorable terms. Would you get more favorable terms if you moved one way or the other? Think about it. I'm not going to try to solve that problem here. But this is an interesting device. And people use this internally in companies to work out how are we going to set up our HR policies? If we're going to invest, if we're going to look at Metro in this case, where does India sit on this? India probably has a high degree of collectivism, but probably a low degree of power respect, power distance. Because there's that, and they're in a really sort of funny place. And that, if I'm right about that, then there's quite a big contrast to the situation with the German mentality coming in. And German managers are going to have to flip the way of thinking quite a lot to be able to accommodate the Indian mentality, not just on religious grounds, but on this notion of, how collective are we? Are we more collective or less collective in our approach? They're probably more collectivist, I think.
Actually, India is one of the most individualistic.
You think so?
Yeah, there.
You think so?
In comparison to others.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, we could theoretically test this and find out where they are, but it's certainly one of the issues that if you're running the company, you're going to think about it. If you're setting the strategy for the company, you're going to have to think about this. How do we organize the company to do this? What structures do we put in place? If you put in a structure that's completely inappropriate to the people you're going to be employing, you're going to find that nobody goes along with what you're doing because there's a deeply held belief. And that's what the rest of this stuff is about. You get culture has manifestation in the form of behavior. That's what you see, but it's not what happens. It's not what matters. It's what happens below the line that's often more important. If you have a situation where there's strong beliefs and attitudes, assumptions, taken for granted institutional arrangements of the way we do things around here that will prevent you from doing things. When we were at Reuters in New York, they tried to change our behavior by changing reporting lines so that the journalists reported to the business managers instead of to the editors. It was something that the managers thought would make us more responsive to customers. And what it did was unearthed the fact that the journalists didn't want anything to do with the business. A lot of the journalists didn't even believe in the business of selling information to banks and stock brokerages and things like that, thought this was evil. And what we were really about as journalists was telling the truth, shedding light in dark places, as a colleague of mine used to say. That's the value of the journalism. That's why we were in the business. That's what we valued, what our assumptions were. And they were trying to change behavior in a way that went against what we were doing. And needless to say, they found quite a rebellion on their hands among the journalists. But not just among the journalists, because in fact, a lot of people in the company, in other capacities, felt that that's what was really good about Reuters. That Reuters stood for unearthing the truth and making sure the truth got disseminated widely. Whatever truth is. That's another story. We won't get into that. And those kinds of things, if you run into a big cultural problem, then you're going to run into trouble with your strategy. And that's part of, I think, what happened with Metro. And part of what you're going to see working in companies that you cover, which is why I raise it. Some companies don't have that. Some companies have different shapes, I think. Shapes like that, or even shapes like this. The coal center industry is based on behavior, and nobody has any beliefs at all about it. So what happens? The structure of that business is very different from the structure of other kinds of businesses. Call centers assume, you know what I mean by call centers? You telephone to get service about your things. Okay. Call centers assume typically that they're going to have 80 to 90% of their staff leave within 12 months. So they're constantly recruiting new people because nobody wants to work in a call center. There are no beliefs, except that call center is a bad place to make a career. And so you use it as the first job out of when you finished school or when you finished university. Use it, do it for a while until you find something else, then you move on. There's no belief structure that gets built up in the company at all. And if you can design a business model that's based on the notion that you replace staff very rapidly, then that can be quite a successful business. Without any beliefs, without any attitudes, without any underlying assumptions, except the underlying assumption that none of this stuff matters very much. And so you treat people badly because there's no reason to treat them well, which means it's a crappy but profitable business. Yeah. So we can carry on and on and on talking about this, but that's not the only thing I wanted to talk about today in this second session. So, where's the other one? Is this the other one? Yes. There are, that's not it. That's somebody else's. So now we've talked about different ways of organizing businesses. We've begun to talk about structures and how those fit together with cultures and things like that. And now we think about how do we move beyond this? We've got a company, whatever company it is. Could be the newspaper company, magazine. It could be Metro. It could be Microsoft and Nokia. How do we organize this? How do we put it together? It used to be that a lot of companies did everything all by themselves. When I started out as a reporter, one of the stories I was given by an editor, and I was supposed to edit the work of 2 other people, and we worked as a 3-person team to do a piece of investigative journalism about the structure of the telephone supply industry in the United States, because AT&T, which was at the time the monopoly provider of long-distance telephone services in the United States, had decided to become its own supplier of copper for wires. So what they were doing was building capacity to take in scrap copper, melt it down, and create copper cables so they could buy their copper cables from themselves to capture more of the value. This is backward integration, is what it's called in the trade, because you're moving back in the supply chain. The scrap metal merchants were furious about this because they felt their biggest customer was going into competition with them. Think about that in terms of 5 forces. It looks really nasty because it's a big power play against small guys. And they tried to kick up a stink, get a regulatory change saying this was anti-competitive practices on behalf of AT&T, that we're going to force them out of business. And we're going to do damage to consumers by ultimately raising the cost of telephony through a long chain of things. And at the time, that was AT&T's business. They were thought was got to do something to secure that we have control of the supply of copper for our own operations, and potentially, therefore, to become suppliers to the local telephone companies who would eventually become their competitors. Big power play. How do we do this? We could configure the business that way, or we could not. Most companies, when I was growing up, had cleaning departments. Nobody has a cleaning department now anymore at all. You contract with a cleaning specialty company to come in and clean your offices, right? Does any company you know in Ukraine have cleaners employed by the company itself rather than a contract cleaning company? Maybe. But there aren't very many in the Western economies now at all, because everybody has recognized, if you think back to when we were talking about resources and what resources are important, the resources that are important for a company that's manufacturing aircraft engines, they need clean manufacturing facilities, yes. But do they have to control are they going to know anything about technological improvements in cleaning in their offices? No. But a cleaning specialty company will keep abreast of it. When there's a new material that comes out, a new solvent that helps them to clean things, a new type of vacuum cleaner, a new type of device that saves them time, they'll pay attention to it because that resource, that knowledge is important to the future of their business, the competitiveness of their business. And so most companies have outsourced the cleaning. And then you start saying, well, where does the outsourcing stop? What do we do? Well, there are ways of looking at that. One of them is the value chain. We would have looked at the value chain yesterday if I'd had more time. So I'll give you the first run through of this. This is, again, Michael Porter's notion of how do we break up and understand what's going on inside a company? And he said there are all kinds of activities that take place. These are not departments of a company. They're activities, things that people do inside companies. And they all have to do this sort of stuff. They all have to bring things into the company, inbound logistics. They all operate on something. They do something with it. They then have to get it out of. If you think of a manufacturing company, it's really simple. They have to get it out of the factory, out to customers. They have to sell things to customers and deal with the customers later on about the after-sales service. And to do that, they have to go through a variety of activities that are sort of more common across all of those different types of activities. They all have to buy things of one description or other. So the processes of purchasing, procurement, they all have to have some kind of technology. That doesn't have to be high technology. It could be the supply of cleaning technologies if you have to clean a department. They all have to have people. And they all have to have bosses, firm infrastructure, data systems, accounting. All have to have those things. So those activities are going to take place inside all kinds of companies. And what we can do is look at those activities and say, do those activities make any sense? Are they making money? Are they contributing value or are they destroying value? Indeed, a whole branch of accounting sprang up in the wake of this publication called activity-based costing, ABC, which you might hear about this week. Let's take a look at, how do we measure this? How do we find out whether we're adding value or not when we do something? And so people started thinking about it, and value chain became embedded in the way people talk about business. Indeed, it's really common. This is how it works for copiers. Michael Porter's example. You have various different things that take place. Let's look at them. Let's measure. Are they doing things? Are they getting a good value out of it? Are you getting more out at the end of the process than you had at the beginning? And if you're not, then you reconfigure it. Maybe what you do is say, we're no good at materials handling and inspecting stuff. We're an internationally active business. We're going all over the world with things. We're bringing stuff in from all over in different parts. And we don't know whether the parts are coming in right or not. Why don't we hire somebody who's really good at customs union and how those things work? Really good at knowing whether we're meeting all the regulations for import and export. To test whether our incoming stuff is working well. There's a company in Switzerland that specializes in doing just that. It's called SGS. Maybe we'll hire SGS to do this part of it. So we don't have to do that anymore. So we can concentrate on doing this because we're really good at making components. Maybe we're not any good at making components. Maybe we should outsource that too. What we're good at is assembling components. And so you have choices you can make about how you configure the business. How much do you do in-house? How much do you do out-of-house? This gives you a way of judging that. And so we could think about this. How do we think about it? It depends on the individual circumstances of the companies, the individual circumstances of the industry, all the rest of the analysis you've done before. This thing comes as the next stage in that, saying, well, what are we doing well? And what choices do we make about the structure of the company? How much do we do? How much does somebody else do? This gives you an indication that this is the way people talk about it all the time, and this too comes from Porter's own book, is that sometimes you are your own supplier. And sometimes that makes sense. But if it doesn't make sense, and you get down to the detailed level of activities, maybe what you ought to do is get it from somebody else. Ford Motor Company in the United States used to own a steel mill. Not only did it used to own a steel mill, it used to own an iron ore mine and a coal mine, because you need coal and iron ore to make steel. And the reason they've developed all of this was because in the First World War, the US government stopped Ford Motor Company from getting steel because they wanted to make tanks. National security reasons. So they confiscated all the steel supply. And Henry Ford decided he was never going to suffer this thing again. And never was he going to allow the government to mess up his business. He was going to own his own things, and damn those characters if they tried to nationalize his business. And 70 years later, they had one of the least efficient steel mills working on the poorest quality iron ore and the nastiest, dirtiest coal in the world, because that's the stuff the company happened to own. And it wasn't terribly surprising that Ford Motor Company had become unprofitable as a result of that. So finally, the company got rid of this legacy that was left over that made no economic sense whatsoever. They looked at it and said, we're not efficient anymore. We have to do something. We have to reconfigure this business. Let's sell off those assets. They're not assets. They're really liabilities. Get rid of it. Compete on a normal basis. But you can still make legitimate choices between these things. Some companies, like Daimler in Germany, makers of Mercedes-Benz cars, make many, many things in-house. And other companies like Audi, which is very close, the headquarters of Audi is very close to Daimler. Audi buys in pre-assembled things, lots of things in different places. Completely different business model as to what the boundaries of the company are. You have choices to make. You have to make decisions about why you're doing that. Why this rather than that? This is a tool that people use to analyze it. So when you're interviewing somebody in companies and they talk about value chains, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about this as a supply chain, because there are phases along this where things go from one company to another. How do we manage our supply chain? How do we link all of these components together? Companies can get into trouble when their supply chains mess up. There's some really famous examples of this. I know, well, in front of certain groups of students, I have mentioned the word Nike. You all know Nike, right? Shoes, right? Nike. Shirts, sporting goods. And I'd mention Nike to students and they'd say, oh, that's a terrible company. Because the company was found at one point or other to have used a supplier that used a subcontractor to manufacture footballs in Pakistan. And the footballs were being sewn by children as young as 10 years old. And Nike had no knowledge of the fact that this was happening. And then stupidly denied it was happening without having checked, and got themselves into an enormous, it was about 20 years ago, got themselves into enormous difficulties because the lie was found out. Lie. It wasn't a lie, it was bad information. They didn't know, but they said something they didn't know. It damaged their reputation for 10, 15 years. People were saying, oh, Nike, child labor, terrible. When in fact it was a subcontractor of a subcontractor. That is, not this position in the supply chain, but that position. And so, as a result of that, a lot of companies, particularly in consumer industries, have gone into very detailed management of suppliers to check whether they're complying with law, whether they're complying with customer expectations. And that raises interesting things, because with the internet, you can do a lot more with the supply chain than just inspect whether they've got child labor. You could tell your suppliers, that you're anticipating sales of this volume of stuff so that they can plan their business activities to match that. And they can tell or you could even tell their suppliers about your plans so they can forecast their production more easily, and you can create greater efficiencies. You can create greater profitability by sharing information through the supply chain. Now, this started to happen well before the internet was around, and companies used to create what are called electronic data interchanges, EDI systems, to do this kind of thing. And the internet sort of completely transformed that and made that kind of thing available to all sorts of businesses at all sorts of levels, and allowed you to do supply chain management through greater control over the flow of information that allowed people to replicate the kinds of things that Toyota did. Toyota invented a system a long time ago called Kanban that lots and lots of companies have copied. And they created a thing where they were they used to do this on paper, where they would keep track of things and hand the stuff back so that their suppliers could deliver things to them just before it was needed. It was called just-in-time supply chain management. So they never had too much stuff in the shop, reduced the inventory because they only got deliveries at the time they needed a particular part. And by sharing that information further and further back in the supply chain, everybody in the supply chain only got things as soon as they needed it, which meant that nobody was carrying very much inventory. And as we learned yesterday, having too much inventory, having inventory at all, is a cost to the business, so you could reduce the costs. It made the place much, much more efficient. And that's how Toyota took over leadership in global car markets, largely through using that kind of technology. Probably the most foolish thing that Toyota did in that time was to invite the other car companies to see what they were doing. And everybody started copying them. They didn't realize what a valuable resource they had, how rare it was, how difficult to imitate it would be, and how without substitute it could possibly be. And they gave away a big source of their competitive advantage. The car industry is a lot better for it. So, that's supply chains. We don't have time to go through it. We've also got other ways of configuring it, though, because you don't have to own everything. You could build things. You could make things yourself. You could buy something. You could acquire it. Or you could borrow it. You could bring it in from someone else. You could enter into strategic alliances or networks. And so there are different approaches to strategy that result from that. And I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. You'll know most of this stuff. Organic development is when you make something yourself, you build it from your own resources. Or you could acquire it. There are advantages to buying things. You get ready-made solutions for things that also have disadvantages. They weren't made for you, so they might not fit properly. You could buy a company that produces something that you need, but you might find that the culture of that company is very different from your own, so you got problems with it. On the other hand, you could build something and build it right in your image. You could do what Metro's doing and try to roll out the German model into yet another marketplace and make it work, and it doesn't work because it doesn't quite fit, not quite right. So there are benefits and drawbacks on both sides. You have to make choices. Business people make these choices all the time. That's one of the things you can ask people about when they're doing business is, which way, why did you decide this? Was it on the basis that you expected this or that? Because you can anticipate the way they think about it. And there are different modes of entering countries as a result of that. You could come in through things where you actually own something, whether it's a greenfield investment that is building FDI, building your own plant and equipment, or doing some kind of joint venture with an existing party or something in between. You can also do soft modes and do things without a lot of ownership. The simplest way of getting into a new market is to enter it by export, by selling a few things. But there are drawbacks, because you don't really know the marketplace very well. You could do other kinds of things. You could move into something that's more like a strategic alliance, where you got an involvement of a partner who can help you do things. And those kinds of things, therefore, become part of it. Supply chains, we've gone through some of this stuff. Alliances and networks, build, buy, borrow. And there are varieties of different versions of these things that differ depending upon what kind of risk you have, what kind of perceived risk you have, and how much control you want to have. You can read more of this. This is where I'm going to stop. If you look at this and say, this kind of chart would give you any of a number of different configurations that you could have to getting involved in this. You could create something that is different from all of those, that involves creating networks of interconnected things, where it's not just a supply chain, but links to lots of different companies that work together, collaborate together, maybe do research together. There's quite a big movement now in business to talk about value co-creation with customers, where you work with customers to create a product, and you both own the product, and you might sell it onto people who are competitors of the customer that you're collaborating with. But that customer of yours is going to get royalty payments for their competitors using their product. There are lots of different ways of configuring businesses that people are experimenting with, partly to reduce the risk associated with these things, because all of these things have tremendous risks. Small companies are using the notion of networks very effectively now to try to make themselves feel bigger, be able to respond like a big company, but without having the risk of all the technology that goes with it, all the product development that goes with it, all of the personnel they have to hire to do this, to create these innovative products. You build that through the network. It also means you sacrifice some of the value, benefits, drawbacks, all the time. It's a balancing act. That's what all of this strategy stuff is about.